WLFE DB Radio.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are gold.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC.
It's getting nice and heavy.
And now, welcome tonight's host, John the Vernomatic Verno.
Good evening, everybody. I'm the Vernomatic, and welcome to this week's show. As always, Thursday nights, new content drops. Visit the metalmayhemroc.com website. There you'll find direct links to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, however you're listening to these podcasts. While you're there, download some past shows, subscribe, review. That kind of stuff helps the bottom line. Sign up for our email list. There you'll receive weekly updates on new shows, merch promos, and free giveaways. Tonight I welcome back to the show Metal Mayhem ROC show contributors and metal historians Ian O'Rourke and Metal Walt. We're doing a series called The History of Metal. Tonight we're highlighting the year 1974. Basically what we're going to do, we're reflecting back on what the hard rock and heavy metal landscape was like at the time, revisiting albums released that year, introducing new bands that debuted, and just basically a fun, informative discussion. We mix in some music, we get the commentary of both Walt and Ian, and, just have, like I said, have a cool discussion. As always, we encourage feedback from you, the listeners. We welcome fact-checking, both your opinions and takes on these bands, as we take a look back at the year 1974. So I'm real excited tonight to have back to the Metal Mayhem ROC podcast from Central New York, co-lead singer and co-lead guitarist of the rock band Motorlord, Ian O'Rourke. Ian, welcome to Metal Mayhem ROC.
Vernomatic, how you doing, brother? Good to be back again.
Good. I'm doing well, thanks. And from the bowels of New Jersey, Metal Mayhem ROC correspondent, Metal Walt. Hey, Walt, welcome back to the show.
Hey, guys. Hey, John. Hi, Ian. Happy to be back and looking forward to 1974.
1974. It was a great year all around. I think I was 7 years old. My Dolphins were going to Super Bowls. The rock and roll and metal world was brewing really well. Last week, we had 1973, and it was the start of this series, and we were able to cover really the pioneers of the hard rock, heavy metal movement. Bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep. God, the list goes on and on. Well, get us up to speed on some of the bands that we covered on the first episode, what they're doing in 74.
Yeah, so I think if you recall in our recap of where we ended on 73, some of the conclusions were there were several new bands on the horizon. They were about to have releases prepared for 74, but they were in those formative stages of maybe recording or just forming with the band members and maybe getting out in the live setting. So a couple of the bands that started in 73 that you saw come actually to life in 74, some really big names. I mean, you had Kiss, you had Rush, Judas Priest, and Bad Company would be what I would say the top four for debut bands that year. And in fact, for the situation of Kiss, they actually put out two albums, their debut album and then Hotter Than Hell. There was also, a big change in the camp of one of the giants of heavy metal, Deep Purple. They went through a major lineup change. And also, as a result of that, brought in a whole new sound to the band. And they also in 74 released two albums. So it was a big year.
Why did Ian Gillan leave and Coverdale and Glenn Hughes got into the band?
I think it was a matter of burnout, as we mentioned, and I think their release in 73 was one of the, let's say, not the most memorable ones. I think they were on the road for 5 straight years. And I think it was a matter of the egos of Ian Gillan and Richie Blackmore coming to the table. I think Blackmore also showed an interest in going, let's say, to a more melodic way. And I think it was just became camps in the band. And I think as a result of that, the Gillen Glover Mark II lineup, the classic lineup, exited. And in came two new members. Again, you remember Glenn Hughes, he kind of debuted as a younger kid in the band Trapeze. And he was the singer and bass player of that band. And, again, they were another group out of the UK. So there were definitely connections there. And I think David Coverdale at the time was maybe an unknown. But they brought a different sound to the band. They brought a bit of a funk element to it. And they brought also the element of having two lead singers that traded off within songs and also took certain songs of their own.
Now, Ian, you're big on the Queen catalog. What was going on with Queen in 74?
So Queen followed up their solid, great debut album, Queen, with Queen 2. When Queen 2 comes out, now you start seeing these elaborations of these really grander, very proggy, they've continued on their route, but still very heavy songs. You've got songs like Seven Seas of Rye and Ogre Battle, which are just monster tunes. Anybody that's any kind of a Queen fan will, they will cite these songs verbatim without too much issue as these monumental songs from the back catalog. Then you have more well-known songs that have come across that almost all of us know from being radio played at one point or another. You have Killer Queen. You have Stone Cold Crazy. You also have songs like Brighton Rock and then Flick of the Wrist. I mean, these are songs that were concert staples for the band all the way through because of the intensity that they had and the attitude that they purveyed coming up through. So when, once you get through the early years, when things start to progress later on, they had a lot more pomp and circumstance with material that they presented, even though they still did it in a very heavy and a grand way. But all of this older material that came from these earlier albums just stayed with them all the way through the years, whenever they would perform. And that was something that really helped to catapult them big, especially within the hard rock and metal community.
So 74 Montrose.
Last album with Sammy, from what you read, apparently Ronnie Montrose was a fickle individual. I don't know if he had personal demons or if he was, secretly self-destructive when it came to stuff. But really, this album, for the most part, is a departure from the first album. The first album is just a solid slab of rock all the way through from beginning to end. On this album, Paper Money, you really only have the title track, Paper Money, and then the song I Got the Fire, which I Got the Fire was a riff that Sammy came up with and, just as of recently reworked into a new song with The Circle after, speaking with Montrose, Ronnie Montrose's, estate, just to let them know, hey, listen, I'm going to reuse this riff. I just wanted to make sure I had you're okay with it.
You know, the interesting thing on what you guys just presented here was you mentioned I Got the Fire, and you also mentioned the Queen song Stone Cold Crazy. Iron Maiden covered that I Got the Fire on the single back in the 80s. Like you mentioned, Metallica was Stone Cold Crazy. So a lot of those songs, it's exemplifying how they're the stepping stones of these later bands that came around in the late 70s and early 80s, and they're pulling from these bands. Now, in 74, there was an interesting development in the Thin Lizzy camp. They released their fourth album, Nightlife, and that was the first album that newcomers Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson on guitar were involved with. Brian Robertson ended up replaced Fast Eddie Clarke in Motorhead, about 10 years later. What do you know about Thin Lizzy, and what was the status of that band in 74 with the Nightlife release?
I know that Eric Bell, the original guitar player, had gotten very burnt out. Actually had a little bit of a mental breakdown mid-show. He admits himself it probably was a combination of touring fatigue, maybe a little bit too much partying, and just, one of those situations where you have somebody that's not comfortable in the spotlight. Having the success at all of any kind thrust on you sometimes can be a burden. So the influence of bands like the Allman Brothers, Lynyrd Skynyrd, and Wishbone Ash was something that kind of had been a point of interest for Phil Lynott. So he goes out and he's trying to, recruit these guys for this band. And, this young kid from Scotland, Brian Robertson, comes in and he's got all this vim and vigor and, bad attitude player and everything else, and gets up there and jams. When he meets Scott Gorham, who just happened to be in England on accident because his family member, his sister's boyfriend, was actually in the band Supertramp, said, why don't you come on out and see if you can audition for a spot in the band? And even though that kind of fell through while he was in England, ended up finding out that Thin Lizzy was looking for a guitar player, did a little quick study on who the band was, when did the audition. When he walked in, Phil Lynott looked at him and saw how he looked with that California good looks and the long hair and said, that guy looks like a rock star. He's in the band.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, it just happened to be good fortune that he had had excellent chops too, and they all got along. So that was the establishment of that classic Thin Lizzy lineup. So good stuff.
Just to finish wrapping up on our recap of bands from last week, the last one I want to mention is Aerosmith. 74, Get Your Wings album comes out March 74. But the significant thing with this is it's the beginning of the relationship with Jack Douglas, their producer. Jack was the man behind the board on those follow-up albums that we're going to rediscover as the 70s moves on. So Metal Walt, it's 1974, and there's a lot more bands coming around with releases. What do you got? Who was new to the scene in 74?
Well, I think you start at the top with the heavy hitter and the debut album of Kiss, followed by their second release, Hotter Than Hell, later in the year. I mean, I think everybody that is a fan of rock and metal knows the first Kiss album. I mean, it is really what was the foundation of the band. I think, you just go right down the list. And there's songs that, you could recite these in your sleep. Probably for any musician has played these songs starting out. And, again, are songs that, 50 years later are in the band's repertoire.
Yeah.
From Strutter to Firehouse, Cold Gin, Deuce, 100,000 Years, and Black Diamond.
I know she'll only make you cry.
to think an album clocking in here is a two-side LP, 10 songs with all those classics clocking in at 35 minutes and 11 seconds is amazing, right? I think also what was interesting about that one was I believe it was the only one with the cover album being in, let's say, the makeup, that they're the only time that they had that particular makeup for the debut. And then I think they tweaked maybe some of the designs, especially on Peter Criss, that he had a different face afterwards.
Yeah, and Gene didn't have the bats, or he had the upside down bats, or it wasn't the one the look that we're all familiar with. Yeah,
and then I think later in the year, October came and they released the second album, Hotter Than Hell. This one, if you recall, the cover had sort of a Japanese Asian influence on there, and it just tells you they're linked to that Japanese culture and that crowd, which was very big for them in the 70s. Again, this is another album. You think about it, from Got to Choose, Parasite, Hotter Than Hell, Watching You, and even really cool, let's say, lesser known tracks such as Strange Ways. I mean, again, they cover it all here. Again, short, good, crisp songs. Mm-hmm. And to think that, to see, two debut albums in the same year that have that much strength, man, that just put those guys on the map. 74 was also a year where you saw them, let's say, as more of a support act for tours. And but I think they prompted very quickly within a year or two into being sort of, you know, mid-size hall and even maybe some arena size capacity. You know, by 75, they were playing all the big places. So they really went from, you know, a whole lot of nothing in 73 up to the big time by 75. And I think it was also the mystique of the band was important at that time in the formative year. You know, I mean, yes, Alice Cooper, and to a degree, I'm certain certain other bands, maybe a David Bowie or somebody like the New York Dolls, you know, they were wearing the makeup and the costumes and things of that nature, but nobody brought it to the level like this, where, again, there was, you know, all you could really learn about the band was through billboard ads in the cities and maybe through, you know, rock or metal magazines or newspapers. And it was the mystique where, you know, all the little things like, you know, they signed a contract in their own blood, to Gene having a part of a cow's tongue stitched into his mouth, to him really making the blood as he spit it out, you know, and that was a big draw, I think, which created the spark in the merchandising, because it attracted not just music fans, but it attracted kids. If you think about where the band went in terms of their image and how they commercialized themselves as a brand within 3 or 4 years, this was really the beginning of it.
Well, another band that came around in 74, one of my favorites, Rush. Great band, debut album, just like Kiss. A lot of these songs found a home in their live set for the first half of their career. Working Man, In the Mood, What You're Doing, you know, Finding My Way. Those were all some staples. Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and John Rutsey the original drummer. Walt, what's your take in your interpretation of Rush in 74?
Well, first of all, I think it's their being their debut album. I think it has the most of their catalog, the most straight ahead, let's call it garage rock sounding songs you're going to get. Really cool, just chunky riffs and grooves, neat fills on the drums and some good melodies in there. And I think this was probably the one and only album where you really fully got that sound. And I'm not even saying that was a direct result of Neil Peart coming in after this. I just think it was, the formation of the band, of Geddy and Alex probably writing together as kids. And, this was sort of the debut material and the sound that they were developing in their, basements and the churches and the places they were playing up in the Toronto area around, that 72, 73 period. I know that they hit the road hard that year as a support act. I know they were, I think, pretty big in the Midwest in that first year. They got a lot of radio airplay on the first album out in Cleveland. So I think they'll always have a soft spot for that town, really giving them a chance. And I think, when you listen back to this album and when most fans think Rush, they don't really think this album. And perhaps maybe aside from Working Man, it's not something that an average Rush fan will, look back at. But really, really strong material and definitely, something that, is a memorable piece. I think even on their R40 tour a couple of years ago, if anybody saw that, they actually did that tour where they worked chronologically backwards. And they ended their show by stripping the stage down to make it look like they were playing in a little school hall. And they ended the show with a little medley of some of the tracks, including Working Man, and I believe What You're Doing, amongst some of the other tracks to end the show. And that's how it ended. And, I think that was a really, really cool way of them recognizing, not only their 40 years, but the importance of the roots of the band in the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to interject and say, the one thing that I can definitely say about the debut album from Rush, yes, it's definitely their most straight ahead hard rock sounding album. Fly By Night still has its moments. You can see where the moments continue, but the progressive moments start to creep in bigger and bigger as time goes on. But that just signifies the ultimate in the fact that Rush was the ultimate progressive rock band, because they started off and they just progressed to a whole other level by the time they were done. And that's why I think they have such a devout following of fans, there's nobody that's, Gene Simmons said it best. He goes, there's no other band that sounds like Rush.
Come
So, Ian, what other bands are coming around in 74?
Well, the first one of significance was at the end of 73, Rob Halford joins Judas Priest as their vocalist. In 74, they released their debut album, Rock-A-Rolla. Now, most fans of Judas Priest, most fans of hard rock and metal in general, it's kind of an underwhelming album. There's really only a couple pieces that kind of stand out or that kind of give you that maybe a snapshot into what may be coming. The song Rock-A-Rolla tends to be something that's a little popular with some of the older fans. And then they also had Run of the Mill, which has been, I think they actually redid it. There was a European live import that they had done a number of years ago. But now you're starting to see this significant change in what is occurring within the hard rock and ultimately heavy metal world with this band forming. The other band, Out of the Ashes of Free, divert off from the band Mott the Hoople with Nick Ralphs. You have Bad Company coming around, and they released their self-titled album. And anybody that's a fan of good old rock or good old hard rock can't get enough. Moving On, Rock Steady, Ready for Love, and their signature song, Bad Company. I mean, the first album is like a greatest hits album right off the get. Yeah. I mean, they're just a solid, great rock band. Paul Rodgers, one of the best vocalists in the history of rock music. They just come out with a banger that year. So, I mean, this is, 74 really it's one of those key years in the building blocks of hard rock and heavy metal as we're going forward. So
now, Walt, I know you're a big Priest fan. What's your take on the Rock-A-Rolla session?
Yeah, I think again, I think this is another one that it definitely has its moments. I think if you give it a deep listen, you'll hear some different things in there that maybe if you rediscover it, you're going to say, hey, this is pretty cool, right? You got some longer songs out in there. I mean, as Ian just mentioned, Run of the Mill clocks in at over 8 minutes. I do recall when they did their Epitaph tour about 10 years ago, they performed Never Satisfied for, I think, the first time in something like 30 years. And I do remember Rob Halford getting up there, and he had the backdrop of the Rock-A-Roll album behind him. And he almost had to explain, where the song came from and that it was on that debut album from, at 40 years ago at that point in time. But, I think, also in thinking of the formation of this band, I mean, again, Rob had really just come on board. And I think there was also maybe some of the material may have been, contributions from the previous singer, Al Atkins. So I think you probably saw an album that was partially, let's say, put together already. And then Glenn Tipton and Halford joining around this time, they kind of, put this release out. But it was sort of, let's say, the beginning of the foundation of their classic lineup, of course, right? And then we know what comes from there, which came out 2 years later, which was the Sad Wings of Destiny album, which is an absolute metal classic. Mm-hmm. So, I think similar to the Rush debut, I think it has elements, and it's a really cool album, but it's not going to be one of those ones where you're going to look back and you're going to, pick 6 or 7 songs and say, oh my God, this is a classic album. Unlike the Bad Company album that Ian mentioned has 75% of it are songs you still hear on the radio today.
All right, well, Priest, so Rock-A-Rolla, Scorpions, they're releasing Fly to the Rainbow in 74. Nothing too special with that. Same thing with like some of these early Priest songs and early Kiss songs. They really became what they were when those live albums came out by each band. But that first Scorpion, that Fly to the Rainbow, such tracks, Speedy's Come In, They Need a Million's a pretty cool song, but it's in my eyes, it sounds a little dated.
Fly to the Rainbow, to me, I mean, it's still a little obscure. They're kind of that blend of, they're pulling in some psychedelic and some krautrock. They got, a little bit of the, the early hard rock that's coming around, a lot of folky stuff. gets tossed in between. It's not. Is it the worst album? No, it's definitely a stepping stone, I think, to this, like Speedy coming.
And at this point, you now have Uli Roth has taken over the reins as the second guitarist, along with Rudolf Schenker in the band. And on the other side, Michael Schenker has now left, and he has established himself with UFO, releasing Phenomenon, which comes right off with, you've got two of the classic songs from these guys, Rock Bottom and Dr. Doctor, right on this first album with Schenker, really setting a different direction and course for the band. There's a couple of other good ones on there, Oh My, Too Young to Know, and Queen of the Deep. These are some good, solid hard rock songs that they're doing. They, too, are in a little bit of a flux with this album, though. There's still a lot of this kind of space rock that they were doing and a lot of the blues rock elements still. But it is still one of those great albums from this time period. And this is something to, a perception to keep, is this, we're talking 1974. So you have to think in that reference when you hear these songs and these riffs and the way they were recorded, what it was at the time to hear something like that. That's a game changer.
Metal Walt, Scorpion fan, or just, I remember last week you didn't have much to comment on him. Still no comment?
Again, I think I'm more of a, later 70s, early 80s Scorpions fan. I mean, I can certainly appreciate, the Uli John Roth material, that's a little bit more, let's say, trippy and has a little bit more of a groove to it. But again, I have to be honest and say haven't been fully immersed in that catalog and that era. But I do know that, it is cool and it's memorable amongst the fans. I think even on their last couple of tours, they did a little 4 or 5 song medley with some of the material there. And I do know Uli John Roth tours on his own and does his own Scorpion show where he performs only material from this era.
That's fair. I respect that take on the Scorpions, and being a fan of all their eras, great stuff. Scorpions, fucking love them. We're going to take a little break, and when we come back, Ian and Metal Walt are going to give us a little snapshot on what's going on in the basements and garages around the world as new bands are going to debut in 75. I'm the Vernomatic. You're listening to The History of Metal, the year 1974, on Metal Mayhem ROC. Friends of the Metal Mayhem ROC podcast, Vernomatic here, inviting you to get those horns up and to join us live Monday nights 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time for Metal Mayhem ROC Live. We crack the vaults open and play the best of the metal from the last 50 years. Get in the chat room, meet other bangers from around the world, send me a request and I'll get it on for you. That's Metal Mayhem ROC Live with me, the Vernomatic, Monday nights, 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on netmetalstation.com.
This edition of Metal Mayhem ROC is brought to you by Mr. V's Street Style Vending and Special Events Catering. Visit our lunch cart in the Collegetown District at Strong Memorial Hospital, or hit up the late night weekend location at the corner of Monroe Avenue and South Goodman. Look us up at mrvsvending.com for catering, pricing, and availability. That's Mr. V's Street Style Vending and Special Events Catering. Now, back to Metal Mayhem ROC.
Welcome back to Metal Mayhem ROC. Tonight we're in episode 2 of The History of Heavy Metal, the year 1974. Now, guys, we've discussed some of the major bands that have started in the early 70s and have gained momentum in 74, and some new bands that have debuted in 74. Ian, what was on the horizon? What kind of bands were forming in garages and basements across the world that would eventually come around and show their face in 75 and beyond, taking a peek into the future?
Well, some real good ones are actually coming. You have Crocus getting their start There was a little-known hard rock band, early heavy metal band from the Canada area by the name of Moxie came out. Helix, another Canadian metal band, makes their debut that year. They finally get their stuff going. There's a band out of Irving, Texas called Point Blank, which came around later on. 81 had a nice little single with the song Nicole. Made some noise for a couple of years there, but they were on the heavier side of the Southern rock vibe, a little bit closer to maybe Blackfoot versus Lynyrd Skynyrd. The Ramones, they got themselves going there, finally taking some inspiration from the Dolls and any of the other noise that was coming from the Stooges out in Detroit. Praying Mantis, the old new wave of British heavy metal band, they got their starts going just like Raven did. And then over in San Francisco, Dave Menichetti was brewing things up and got Yesterday and Today, which would eventually become Y&T, started. So, I mean, there was a lot of really, really good bands that were getting their feet wet and ready to take the next steps within the next year or two. So,
interesting thing on this is it's all the way around the globe. You know, Crocus is Switzerland. You got the Canadian bands with Helix and Moxie. You go down to the T for Texas and Point Blank. Raven, Praying Mantis. They were, like you said, major players in the soon-to-be late 70s, early 80s new wave of British heavy metal movement that we'll touch on. And, then you got Y&T coming up from the ashes of Ashbury Park in San Francisco. What we're doing here is trying to establish the fact that, hey, it may have eventually ended up being with leathers and spikes and, banging your head and all that. But, it didn't start that way, but the attitude and the roots and the philosophy was still there. Metal Walt, any other bands that were forming or coming around 74, 75?
So, yeah, I think, heading out of 74, you also had some existing artists that maybe were looking for a career change. And I'll mention a few because it definitely had a direct impact on, the formation of, let's say, newer or new bands forming in 75. So, one that comes to mind was the Amboy Dukes. In 74, they did release material, and I do know that the song Great White Buffalo was on that last and final album. But this was also the end of that period, which prompted Ted Nugent to go solo, in which he released his debut solo album in 1975, which we'll cover at another time. Going back to the connection of Deep Purple, I think there's a couple important points here. Ronnie James Dio, who was at the time really an unknown, had been kind of hanging around this band called Elk from, let's say, the early 70s. And this was a very different kind of band. It kind of covered a little bit of more like, kind of basic general rock. There were some horns in there and some honky-tonk piano and some things of that nature. But as Roger Glover exited that Mark II lineup, Ronnie James Dio played on a Roger Glover album, a solo album of sorts. And I think that gathered the attention of Ritchie Blackmore, who had heard it, because Glover and Blackmore are obviously, they were not in the best of light in that period. So as it comes about, this became actually, let's say, the spark that initiated discussions amongst the camp of Blackmore and Ronnie James Dio, which eventually put Rainbow on the map for their debut album in 75. And I think the other one that's worth calling out is you think about also with Deep Purple is with Gillan and Gover leaving, something that's maybe, flies, at least in America, a little bit less under the radar is the Ian Gillan Band. But boy, they put out some strong material from the mid-70s, probably up until the early 80s. And he had a really formidable lineup that had some solid players in there. And that was also the formation of the Ian Gillan Band in 75. So definitely sort of out of some of the morphosis of the ends of some bands and lineup changes came changes that eventually you would see realized in either new solo artists or, let's say, new bands forming in 75.
All right, well, hey guys, that's fantastic, because that's pretty much a little bit of a teaser of what's going to be happening in 1975. Like Ian, like you mentioned, as these years are going by from 73 to 74, the releases and the involvement in this scene doubled, and it gets almost doubles again as we go into the 75. Anything you guys want to add to this little commentary before we get going for the night?
I think for as you had mentioned, for us with our recall and any little bit of data that we needed to brush up on, we've touched quite a bit on a lot of material. So anybody that's going to be listening, they're going to have an opportunity to try to get themselves at least acquainted with what's going on, because like you mentioned, going forward, all of these bands are going to be doing a lot more great things, and there's a lot more great bands that are going to be coming along with them. So it's getting exciting.
It certainly is, Ian. Things are getting real exciting. So that's it for tonight. Again, I invite you to visit the Metal Mayhem ROC.com website. You could listen to episode 1 of this series, 1973, and you could also download and listen to all the past episodes that we've put together. We're close to about 75 in the 2.5 years that we've been doing this, so I invite you to check some of our other content out, leave a review, subscribe, that kind of stuff. Don't forget, Monday nights, the Metal Mayhem ROC live radio show on thatmetalstation.com. Find all the information by going to the website. For my co-hosts tonight, Ian O'Rourke from the band Motorlord and Metal Walt from New Jersey, I'm John the Vernomatic Verno, and you've been listening to The History of Heavy Metal, 1974. We'll see you next week, folks. And always remember, keep it heavy.
Metal for life.
Thanks for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our websites at metalmayhemroc.com and metalforever.com for information on upcoming concerts, podcasts, archives, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. Catch us next time on WLFE DB Radio.